the sprawling undercity of Zaun, where innovation blooms from necessity and genius emerges from the shadows. One name echoes through time itself. This is the story of a brilliant young inventor whose curiosity would unlock the very fabric of reality, whose compassion would drive him to protect his people, and whose journey would span multiple timelines and realities. Tonight, we explore the complete chronicle of Ekko, the boy who shattered time, from his humble beginnings as a street-smart orphan to his rise as one of the most extraordinary champions in all of Runeterra. Deep beneath the gleaming towers of Piltover, in the industrial maze known as Zon, a child destined to reshape reality itself drew his first breath. Born in the entresols, the middle levels of this vast undercity, Ekko emerged into a world where necessity bred innovation and survival demanded brilliance. His parents, Inna and Wyeth, were among countless workers who risked their lives daily in the dangerous factories that powered Zon's economy, their bodies slowly wearing down from exposure to toxic chemicals and hazardous machinery that kept the city's heart beating. From his earliest moments, Ekko displayed an extraordinary gift that set him apart from other children in the gray-shrouded streets. While most infants struggled to crawl, he was already constructing simple machines from scraps and refuse, his tiny hands somehow understanding the principles of mechanics and engineering that escaped many adult inventors. His parents watched in amazement as their son dismantled and rebuilt household items before he could properly speak, creating improvements to everyday objects that showcased an intuitive understanding of how the world worked. Enna and Wyeth recognized the exceptional nature of their child's abilities, understanding that such talent could be his pathway out of Zaun's perpetual struggle. They worked themselves to exhaustion, taking on extra shifts and dangerous assignments, all in the hope of earning enough money to secure Ekko's future. Their dream was simple, yet profound. They wanted their brilliant son to climb the social ladder and gain acceptance into one of Piltover's prestigious merchant clans, where his genius could flourish in an environment of resources and opportunity, rather than scarcity and danger. However, as Ekko grew older and began exploring the twisting corridors and forgotten corners of his undercity home, he developed a different vision for his future. The community's make something from nothing mentality inspired him deeply, and he found himself drawn to the creativity and resilience that flourished in Zon's shadows. Rather than seeking escape to the world above, he became fascinated by the potential he saw in his own people, the ingenuity they displayed, despite having access to only discarded materials and outdated technology. During his explorations of Zon's labyrinthine streets, Ekko encountered other young people who shared his perspective and circumstances. Many were orphans who had lost their parents to industrial accidents or had run away from homes where they felt unwanted and misunderstood. These children, like Ekko, possessed sharp minds and innovative spirits that had been shaped by the harsh realities of undercity life. They gravitated toward each other naturally, forming bonds of friendship and mutual support that would prove crucial in the years to come. Together, this group of brilliant misfits became known as the Lost Children of Zon, a gang of young inventors and tinkerers who turned the neighborhood into their personal playground and laboratory. They established their own hideout in an abandoned building, transforming the space into a workshop where they could pursue their projects without interference from adults who might not understand their unconventional methods. While other youths in Zon sought traditional apprenticeships that might lead to stable employment, the Lost Children chose to learn from each other and their environment, sharing knowledge and pushing the boundaries of what was possible with limited resources. With his tribe of like-minded friends supporting him, Ekko's resolve to remain in Zaun only grew stronger. He envisioned a future where he could use his abilities not to escape his community, but to elevate it, creating inventions and innovations that would improve life for everyone in the Undercity. His simple existence, surrounded by friends who understood his passion for creation and discovery, seemed perfect in its own way, despite the dangers and hardships that defined daily life in the industrial maze beneath Piltover. This peaceful chapter of Ekko's life came to an abrupt end on a night that would forever alter the trajectory of his destiny. While scavenging through the remnants of a recently demolished laboratory, searching for useful components and materials, as he had done countless times before, Ekko discovered something that would change not only his life, but the very nature of reality itself. Hidden within the rubble and debris, partially buried beneath twisted metal and broken glass, lay a shard of crystalline material, unlike anything he had ever encountered. The fragment pulsed with an otherworldly energy that seemed to bend light around its edges, creating subtle distortions in the air that made Ekko's eyes water when he stared at it directly. This was no ordinary crystal or mineral, but rather a piece of Hextech technology, the revolutionary power source that fueled Piltover's most advanced inventions and innovations. These crystals were extraordinarily rare and valuable, jealously guarded by the merchant clans who controlled the Hextech trade and used their monopoly to maintain their positions of power and influence. Ekko's mind immediately began racing with possibilities as he examined the mysterious shard, his inventor's instincts recognizing the immense potential contained within this small fragment. He carefully searched the surrounding area for additional pieces, hoping to find more of the crystalline material, but the approaching sound of Piltover enforcers forced him to abandon his search and flee into the safety of Zon's winding passages. Even as he ran through the familiar streets toward home, his thoughts remained focused on the crystal in his pocket and the countless experiments he could conduct with such a powerful energy source, driven by an insatiable curiosity that had defined him since childhood. Ekko began conducting careful experiments with the Hex crystal shard, testing its properties and attempting to understand the principles that governed its operation. His initial investigations proceeded cautiously, as he had heard stories of Hextech devices exploding or malfunctioning catastrophically when handled improperly. However, his natural understanding of mechanical systems and his methodical approach to problem solving allowed him to make rapid progress in unlocking the crystal's secrets. during one particularly ambitious experiment. As Ekko attempted to channel the crystal's energy through a device of his own construction, something extraordinary and terrifying occurred. The fabric of reality itself seemed to tear open before his eyes, creating a rift in space and time that revealed glimpses of other worlds and possibilities. Through this dimensional breach, alternate versions of himself appeared, Ekko variants from different timelines who had made different choices and lived different lives. These temporal echoes worked together with the original Ekko to repair the damage caused by his experiment, using their collective knowledge to seal the rift and restore the proper flow of time. Most people would have been terrified by such an experience. Recognizing the incredible danger of tampering with forces beyond their understanding, Ekko, however, found himself exhilarated by the possibilities that his discovery revealed. Rather than abandoning his research or destroying the crystal to prevent future accidents, he became more determined than ever to harness and control these temporal energies. He understood instinctively that he had stumbled upon something that could revolutionize not just his own life, but potentially the fate of all Zaun. Through months of careful experimentation and countless iterations, Ekko gradually developed a device capable of manipulating time itself. He called his invention the Z-Drive, naming it after his beloved home city and the letter that had come to symbolize the Undercity's resilience and determination. The device was crude by Piltover standards, constructed from salvaged materials and held together with improvised solutions, but it represented a breakthrough in temporal mechanics that even the most brilliant minds in the city above had never achieved. The true test of Ekko's invention came during a celebration of his name day, when his friends convinced him to join them on an expedition to climb the ancient clock tower that loomed over their neighborhood. The structure, known as Old Hungry, had stood for generations as a monument to Zaun's industrial heritage, though age and neglect had made it dangerous for all but the most experienced climbers. Against his better judgment, Ekko brought his untested Z-Drive with him, curious to see how the device might function in a real-world scenario rather than the controlled environment of his workshop. Tragedy struck when Arjuna, one of Ekko's closest friends among the lost children, attempted to traverse a rotting wooden plank that spanned a gap between two sections of the tower. The ancient wood gave way under his weight, sending the young inventor plummeting towards certain death on the industrial machinery far below. In that moment of desperate panic, with his friend's life hanging in the balance, Ekko activated his Z-Drive for the first time outside of his laboratory, pulling the cord that would engage its temporal manipulation systems. The world shattered around Ekko as the device wrenched him backward through swirling particles of time, reality bending and twisting as past and future collapsed into a single moment of possibility. When the disorientation subsided, he found himself watching Arjuna reach for the same rotting plank that had led to his fall, the timeline having reset to moments before the accident occurred. His invention had worked, but controlling its effects proved far more challenging than Ekko had anticipated during his theoretical preparations. 18 times Ekko watched his friend die. 18 times he pulled the cord of his Z-Drive to reset the timeline, and attempt a different approach to preventing the tragedy. With each iteration, he learned more about the subtle art of temporal manipulation, discovering how small changes in timing or positioning could lead to dramatically different outcomes. The process was emotionally exhausting, forcing him to witness Arjuna's death repeatedly while struggling to find the precise combination of actions that would save his friend's life. Finally, on the 19th attempt, Ekko succeeded in preventing the accident entirely, guiding Arjuna away from the dangerous section of the tower and ensuring that all the lost children returned home safely. However, the experience had fundamentally changed Ekko's understanding of his own abilities and the enormous responsibility that came with the power to alter time itself. He realized that his Z-Drive was not merely a tool for fixing mistakes or undoing accidents, but a device capable of reshaping reality according to his will and judgment. The weight of this realization settled heavily on Ekko's shoulders as he contemplated the implications of his discovery. He had essentially become a god of his own timeline, capable of rewriting history whenever events failed to unfold according to his desires. The temptation to use this power for personal gain or to eliminate every inconvenience from his life was enormous. But Ekko understood that such actions would carry consequences far beyond his ability to predict or control. After saving Arjuna and ensuring that his friends remained unaware of the temporal manipulation that had preserved their lives, Ekko made the difficult decision to share the truth about his discovery with the lost children. He revealed the existence of the Hex Crystal and demonstrated some of the Z-Drive's capabilities, though he was careful to emphasize the dangerous nature of his invention and the need for absolute secrecy regarding its existence. His friends were amazed by his achievement, but agreed to keep the knowledge hidden, understanding that such power could attract unwanted attention from forces in both Zaan and Piltover, who might seek to exploit or control temporal technology. However, the knowledge that Ekko possessed the ability to undo any mistake or reverse any tragedy had an unexpected effect on his friend's behavior. The lost children began taking increasingly dangerous risks during their adventures and explorations, confident that Ekko could simply rewind time if anything went wrong. Their limit-testing attitude led them to attempt stunts and challenges that they would never have considered under normal circumstances, creating a false sense of security that would ultimately prove disastrous. The price of this reckless confidence became apparent when the lost children attempted an ambitious theft from one of Zaan's more dangerous districts. Despite Ekko's warnings about the increased risks they were taking, his friends insisted on pursuing their most audacious scheme yet, believing that the Z-Drive made them effectively invulnerable to consequences. When the job inevitably went wrong and they found themselves in mortal peril, Ekko activated his device to prevent disaster, but the strain of repeated temporal manipulations was beginning to take its toll on both his equipment and his own physical condition. These experiences taught Ekko valuable lessons about the nature of power and responsibility, forcing him to confront the ethical implications of his abilities. He began to understand that the Z-Drive was not a solution to all of life's problems, but rather a tool that required wisdom and restraint in its application. The temptation to create a perfect timeline where no one ever suffered or made mistakes was strong, but Ekko recognized that such a world would rob people of the growth and learning that came from facing challenges and overcoming obstacles through their own efforts. As word of Ekko's unusual talents began to spread through Zaun's underground networks, he found himself caught between the desire to help his community and the need to protect the secret of his temporal abilities. The young inventor realized that his childhood dreams of using his gifts to elevate Zaun would require careful planning and discretion, as the wrong people learning about the Z-Drive could lead to catastrophic consequences for everyone he cared about. The celebration of Ekko's name day approached with all the bittersweet complexity that marked special occasions in Zaun, where joy was always tempered by the harsh realities of Undercity life. His parents, Enna and Wyeth, had been planning something special for weeks, though they had tried to keep their preparations hidden from their brilliant son, who seemed to notice everything that happened in their small apartment. The anticipation in their tired eyes spoke of sacrifices made and resources carefully hoarded, the kind of desperate love that drove working parents to give their children moments of happiness despite their own exhaustion. As the day arrived, Ekko found himself torn between excitement and a growing sense of dread that had been building in his chest for months. The success of his temporal experiments and the creation of the Z-Drive had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never imagined, but they had also forced him to confront truths about himself and his future that he was not certain he was ready to face. The device hidden in his workshop represented power beyond anything the merchant clans of Piltover possessed. Yet he remained trapped by the expectations and dreams that his parents had built around his potential. Throughout his childhood, Ekko had absorbed countless conversations between Enna and Wyeth about their hopes for his future, whispered discussions that took place after they thought he had fallen asleep. He knew that they had once harbored their own dreams of joining a Piltover merchant clan and changing the world with their inventions, ambitious plans that had been abandoned when the realities of parenthood and survival took precedence. Their sacrifices for his education and opportunities weighed heavily on his conscience, creating a burden of gratitude that felt increasingly impossible to bear. The young inventor had practiced the speech he planned to give his parents dozens of times, standing before the cracked mirror in his room and rehearsing the words that would explain his true desires. He wanted to tell them that his future lay not in escaping Zaun, but in elevating it, that his talents could serve his community better than they could ever serve the merchant clans, who looked down on Undercity dwellers with contempt and disdain. However, each time he imagined their faces upon hearing this news, his resolve crumbled under the weight of their exhausted hope. When Enna and Wyeth finally returned home from their shifts at the factories, their fatigue was immediately apparent in every line of their bodies. Years of exposure to toxic chemicals and dangerous machinery had aged them beyond their actual years, leaving them with the slow, careful movements of people whose bodies had been pushed far past their natural limits. Yet, despite their obvious exhaustion, they greeted their son with genuine warmth and excitement, their eyes lighting up with the anticipation of the surprise they had prepared for his special day. The gift they presented to Ekko took his breath away and broke his heart simultaneously. Wrapped carefully in repurposed fabric was a cake from one of the finest pastry chefs in all of Entresals. A confection so elaborate and expensive that it represented luxury beyond anything their family had ever possessed. The young inventor immediately understood the magnitude of this gesture, recognizing that his parents had likely spent an entire day's wages, perhaps more, to purchase something that would bring him a few moments of joy. When Ekko protested that such an extravagance was unnecessary and far too costly for their modest household budget, Enna and Wyeth dismissed his concerns with the casual certainty of parents who had made their choice long ago. They explained that his happiness was worth any sacrifice, that seeing their brilliant son enjoy his name day mattered more than any temporary financial hardship they might endure. Their love was absolute and unconditional, a force so powerful that it rendered practical considerations irrelevant in the face of their child's welfare. As his parents insisted that the entire cake was his to enjoy, refusing to accept even a single bite for themselves despite his repeated attempts to share. Ekko felt the crushing weight of their selfless devotion when they began to sing the traditional name day song, their voices growing softer as exhaustion overtook them. He watched helplessly as they nodded off at the table, still humming the familiar melody. The sight of these two people who had given everything for his future falling asleep over their own gift to him crystallized the impossible position in which he found himself. The speech he had prepared died in his throat, killed by the realization that telling his parents the truth about his intentions would destroy something precious and irreplaceable. How could he explain that he had no desire to join the merchant clans they had sacrificed everything to prepare him for, that their dreams for his future felt like a betrayal of everything he had come to value about Zahn's resilient community? The words that had seemed so clear and necessary in his rehearsals now felt like acts of cruelty against two people whose only crime was loving him too much. Yet, even as his resolve faltered, Ekko's mind continued to wrestle with the fundamental contradictions of his situation. His parents worked themselves to death, building machines and components for the same Piltover elite who looked down on Zahn with disgust and contempt, their labor enriching people who would never acknowledge their skill or dedication. The injustice of this system burned in his chest like acid, made worse by the knowledge that his own exceptional abilities could be used to challenge and change these inequitable arrangements. The invention hidden in his workshop represented possibilities that his parents could never imagine. Technologies that could revolutionize not just individual lives, but entire social structures. With the Z-Drive and his understanding of temporal mechanics, Ekko possessed knowledge that surpassed anything developed in Piltover's most advanced laboratories. Why should he waste such extraordinary gifts serving masters who would never see him as anything more than a useful tool from the Undercity, especially when those same gifts could be used to transform Zahn itself? As his parents slept peacefully at the table, their breathing shallow from years of inhaling factory toxins, Ekko made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Rather than wake them with his painful truth or allow the night to end with his cowardice intact. He reached for his Z drive and activated its temporal manipulation systems. The world dissolved around him as reality rewound itself, pulling him back to the moment when his parents had first entered their apartment with the precious cake hidden behind their backs. This time, Ekko told himself he would find the courage to speak honestly about his future and his dreams. He would explain that his talents belonged to Zahn rather than Piltover, that their sacrifices had not been wasted, but simply directed toward a different kind of success than they had originally imagined. The words would be difficult to say and painful to hear, but surely honesty was better than deception, even when that honesty caused immediate hurt. However, as the familiar scene unfolded once again, Ekko discovered that his resolve remained as fragile as it had been during the original timeline, when his parents presented their gift with such evident joy and pride, when they spoke of their dreams for his future with such conviction and hope. He found himself unable to shatter their illusions. The weight of their love and sacrifice pressed down on him like a physical force, making speech impossible and honesty feel like the cruelest form of betrayal. The temporal loop repeated itself again and again as Ekko desperately searched for a version of events where he could tell his parents the truth without destroying their happiness. He experimented with different approaches and timing, trying to find the perfect words that would convey his intentions while minimizing the pain of disappointment. Each attempt ended in failure as he discovered that some truths were simply too heavy to bear, some conversations too difficult to navigate successfully. Through 6 iterations of the same evening, Ekko learned the horrible lesson that power over time could not solve every problem or heal every wound. His ability to rewind and retry gave him infinite opportunities to perfect his approach, but it could not change the fundamental nature of the situation he faced. His parents' dreams and his own desires were incompatible, and no amount of temporal manipulation could reconcile these opposing visions without causing genuine harm to people he loved. The realization that he was using his extraordinary abilities to manipulate the people closest to him filled Ekko with a profound sense of shame and self-disgust. Each time he reset the timeline, he was essentially forcing his parents to relive the same emotional experience without their knowledge or consent, treating their feelings and reactions as variables in an experiment, rather than respecting their autonomy as human beings. The power that had seemed like such a blessing was revealing itself to be a curse that corrupted even his most intimate relationships. Finally, exhausted by his repeated failures and sickened by his own manipulative behavior, Ekko allowed the timeline to proceed naturally without further intervention. He sat in silence as his parents sang their name day song, letting their voices wash over him like a lullaby that carried all the weight of their hopes and dreams. When they finally succumbed to sleep at the table, he did not wake them or attempt to force the conversation he had been avoiding. Instead, he covered them gently with blankets and cleaned up the remnants of their celebration, moving quietly through the apartment while they rested. The untouched cake sat on the counter as a monument to their sacrifice and his cowardice, a sweet reminder of love freely given and truth withheld. As he prepared for bed, Ekko understood that some decisions could not be rushed or forced, that the conversation with his parents would have to wait until he found the strength to face it honestly. The lessons learned during that terrible name day would echo through Ekko's life for years to come, shaping his understanding of power and responsibility in ways that no amount of theoretical study could have achieved. He had discovered that the ability to control time was meaningless without the wisdom to know when such control should be exercised, and that even the most advanced technology could not solve the fundamental problems of human relationships and moral choice. The memory of using his Z drive to manipulate his parents' emotional experience would serve as a constant reminder of the ethical boundaries that must govern the use of extraordinary power. Ekko swore to himself that night that he would never again use temporal manipulation to control or deceive the people he cared about, understanding that such actions violated the trust and autonomy that formed the foundation of genuine love and friendship. Yet, even as he made this solemn promise, Ekko knew that the fundamental conflict between his parents' dreams and his own convictions remained unresolved. The conversation they needed to have would eventually take place, but it would happen through honest dialogue rather than temporal trickery. The truth might cause pain and disappointment, but it would be authentic in a way that no amount of timeline manipulation could ever achieve. The weight of these realizations settled over Ekko like a heavy cloak as he contemplated the future that stretched ahead of him. His inventions were growing more sophisticated with each passing day, and his understanding of temporal mechanics continued to deepen through experimentation and study. However, the power he possessed carried responsibilities that extended far beyond mere technical mastery, demanding wisdom and ethical clarity that could only be developed through careful reflection and moral growth. As sleep finally claimed him, Ekko's dreams were filled with visions of possible futures where his choices led to different outcomes for himself, his family, and his beloved city of Zaan. Some of these timelines showed him achieving great success in Piltover, while his parents glowed with pride at his accomplishments. Others revealed him remaining in the Undercity and using his abilities to transform his community from within, creating innovations that elevated everyone rather than just himself. The multiplicity of these potential futures served as both inspiration and warning, reminding Ekko that every choice he made would ripple outward through time to affect countless other lives. The Z Drive had given him unprecedented power over his own timeline. But with that power came the obligation to consider not just what he could do, but what he should do for the greater good of everyone whose lives intersected with his own. The explosion that shattered the tranquility of Entresols came without warning, a thunderous roar that shook the foundations of buildings throughout Zaan's middle levels and sent clouds of debris cascading through the gray-choked air. From his workshop window, Ekko watched in horror as one of the tallest spires, owned by the Piltovan merchant family known as Clan Pharos, collapsed in on itself, the ancient structure crumbling like a house of cards as fires bloomed from its broken windows. The sight filled him with immediate concern for his friend Lem, who had developed an unfortunate fascination with climbing tall structures ever since taking Arjuna's surname in honor of their fallen companion. Racing through the winding passages of Zaun's interconnected districts, Ekko made his way toward the site of the explosion with growing urgency. The acrid smell of burning chemicals and melted metal filled his nostrils as he navigated the chaos that had erupted in the spire's vicinity, dodging falling debris and panicked citizens who fled in all directions, seeking safety from the continuing structural collapses. When he finally located Lem among the crowd of survivors, relief flooded through him as he confirmed that his friend had escaped the disaster unharmed. Though the young inventor's eyes were wide with shock and confusion, Lem's account of recent events added new layers of mystery to an already puzzling situation. According to his friend, a notorious criminal known as Scary Janet had stolen Ekko's time winder during the confusion following the explosion, making off with one of his most carefully crafted inventions, while emergency responders struggled to contain the fires and evacuate injured civilians. The theft represented more than just the loss of valuable equipment, as the time winder contained technologies that could be reverse engineered by anyone with sufficient technical knowledge to understand its construction principles. The confrontation with Scary Janet proved to be brief but educational, demonstrating once again that Ekko's inventions were far superior to anything being produced by other young criminals in Zaun's underground markets. His combat skills, honed through years of navigating the dangerous streets and refined through countless sparring sessions with his fellow lost children, allowed him to retrieve his stolen property without suffering serious injury. However, the ease with which he defeated an opponent who had built a fearsome reputation throughout the Undercity served as a reminder of how much his abilities had grown since he first began experimenting with temporal manipulation. With his time winder safely recovered, Ekko made his way to the hideout where he expected to find his companions, analyzing the situation and planning their response to whatever forces had caused such devastating destruction. The familiar space that had served as their sanctuary and workshop for so many years felt different, somehow charged with an undercurrent of tension that suggested significant changes were approaching. His friends, Red and Amanda, greeted him with news that painted a troubling picture of the political situation developing in the aftermath of the explosion. According to their intelligence gathering, the powerful Piltovan family, known as the Pharaohs, had been spotted moving through Zaun in the hours following the spire's collapse, their presence suggesting that the explosion had not been an accident, but rather the result of some larger conspiracy. The Pharaohs were known throughout both cities as ruthless manipulators who would stop at nothing to protect their business interests, particularly their monopoly on Hextech crystal production and distribution. Their involvement in undercity affairs inevitably meant that ordinary citizens would suffer, while the powerful pursued their shadowy agendas. More disturbing still was the revelation that members of the Piltovan merchant class had been recruiting children from Zaun's poorest districts to scavenge through the rubble of destroyed buildings, offering small payments in exchange for dangerous work that adult laborers would refuse. The sight of these young people risking their lives to recover materials for families who viewed them as expendable tools filled Ekko with righteous anger, reminding him of all the reasons why he had chosen to remain in Zaun rather than seeking acceptance from the merchant clans above. The decision to check on his parents' safety proved to be more complicated than Ekko had anticipated, as his journey home was interrupted by an encounter that would fundamentally alter his understanding of his own future. As he approached the familiar apartment building where he had spent his childhood, a figure emerged from the shadows with movements that seemed strangely familiar despite being performed by a complete stranger. The mysterious individual's attempts at concealment were clumsy and obvious, triggering every survival instinct that Ekko had developed during years of navigating Zaun's dangerous streets. When the stranger finally revealed himself after a brief but intense confrontation, Ekko found himself staring at a face that was unmistakably his own, though marked by years of hardship and bearing modifications that spoke of a darker timeline than anything he had previously imagined. This older version of himself possessed cybernetic augmentations that had replaced portions of his body, most notably a mechanical arm that gleamed with the distinctive blue-white energy signature of advanced hex-tech integration. The sight was both fascinating and deeply unsettling, forcing Ekko to confront the possibility that his own future might involve sacrifices he could not yet comprehend. Future Ekko's explanation of his presence painted a grim picture of timeline, where the explosion they had just witnessed was merely the beginning of a series of catastrophic events that would reshape both Zaun and Piltover in the years to come. According to his older self, the destruction of the Pharaoh's Spire had been caused by the mishandling of experimental crystal technology known as hexite, an unstable variant of traditional hex-tech power sources that possessed far greater destructive potential than anything previously developed by Piltovan researchers. The story that unfolded revealed layers of corporate intrigue and criminal conspiracy that stretched from the highest levels of Piltovan society down into the darkest corners of Zaun's underworld. Clan Pharaohs, in their relentless pursuit of greater profits and market dominance, had secretly contracted with the notorious Kim Baron family known as the Piltradestra to mass-produce synthetic hex-tech crystals using dangerous shortcuts and untested methodologies. The arrangement had been designed to bypass the traditional limitations on crystal availability while maintaining Pharaoh's control over the lucrative hex-tech trade. However, the Piltradestra had betrayed their Piltovan partners by developing an even more unstable version of the synthetic crystals, creating what they called hexite through processes that prioritized quantity over safety. These new crystals possessed incredible energy output capabilities, but were prone to catastrophic failures that could level entire city blocks when their containment systems were compromised. The explosion that had destroyed the Pharaoh's Spire was merely the first manifestation of a technology that threatened to consume both cities in an orgy of uncontrolled destruction. Future Ekko's mission in returning to this timeline was to prevent the escalating crisis that would unfold if the hexite crystals were allowed to proliferate throughout both Zaun and Piltover. In his original timeline, the unstable crystals had caused a series of increasingly devastating explosions that had claimed thousands of lives and left vast portions of both cities uninhabitable. The environmental damage had been so severe that entire districts had been abandoned, their populations displaced into refugee camps where they struggled to survive amid the toxic fallout of failed Hextech experiments. The older Ekko's plan for preventing this catastrophic future involved locating and securing all existing Hexite crystals before they could be activated or weaponized by the various factions seeking to exploit their destructive potential. This mission required precise coordination and intimate knowledge of both cities' underground networks, as the crystals had been scattered throughout Zon following the initial explosion, and were now being sought by multiple groups with conflicting agendas. Working alongside his future self proved to be both enlightening and deeply disturbing for the younger Ekko, as he witnessed firsthand the psychological toll that years of temporal manipulation had taken on his older counterpart. The cybernetic modifications were just the visible manifestation of deeper changes that had transformed the idealistic young inventor into a hardened operative willing to make whatever sacrifices were necessary to achieve his goals. The easy smile and quick wit that defined Ekko's personality had been replaced by a grim determination that spoke of losses too painful to fully acknowledge. Their investigation led them deep into the industrial sectors of Zon, where the most dangerous and experimental technologies were developed away from the prying eyes of Piltovan regulators. The facilities they discovered revealed the true scope of the Hexite project and the casual disregard for safety that had characterized its development from the very beginning. Workers in these underground laboratories had been exposed to dangerous levels of crystal radiation without proper protection, their health sacrificed on the altar of corporate profits and criminal ambition. The descent into the sump, Zaun's lowest and most toxic level, brought them face to face with the environmental consequences of unchecked technological development. Here, amid the poisonous vapors and chemical waste that had accumulated over decades of industrial abuse, they encountered creatures that had been twisted by exposure to unstable energies. The most terrifying of these mutations was Warwick, once a human being who had been transformed into a monstrous predator through the cruel experiments of the chemist known as Singed. The confrontation with Warwick tested both versions of Ekko in different ways, forcing them to choose between practical necessities and moral principles. Future Ekko advocated for killing the creature while it was vulnerable, arguing that Warwick's continued existence would lead to countless deaths in the years to come. The younger Ekko found himself unable to execute a defenseless opponent, even one as dangerous as the transformed monster, clinging to principles that his older self had apparently abandoned along the path to their shared dark future. This philosophical disagreement highlighted the fundamental differences that had emerged between the two versions of the same person, revealing how the weight of responsibility and the pressure of impossible choices had gradually eroded the moral certainties that defined the younger Ekko's worldview. Future Ekko's willingness to commit murder in service of the greater good represented a line that his younger self was not yet prepared to cross, though he could see how circumstances might eventually force such terrible decisions upon him. The discovery of Admiral Saul Carith's involvement in the Hexite conspiracy added another layer of complexity to an already tangled web of corporate and criminal alliances. Korath, once a respected officer in Piltover's enforcement division, had apparently been corrupted by promises of wealth and power, using his position to facilitate the smuggling operations that had distributed Hexite crystals throughout both cities. His betrayal of his oath and his people represented the kind of institutional corruption that made meaningful reform seem impossible through conventional means. As they worked to track down the remaining crystals, Ekko began to understand why his future self had become so ruthless in his methods and so willing to sacrifice individuals for the sake of broader objectives. The sheer scale of the conspiracy they were uncovering, combined with the time constraints imposed by the crystal's inherent instability, created pressure that could break even the strongest moral convictions. Every moment they spent debating ethics was another moment that brought the timeline closer to the catastrophic future that future Ekko had witnessed firsthand. The revelation that Camille, the principal intelligencer of Clan Pharos, had been aware of their temporal activities but had chosen not to intervene, came as both a relief and a source of additional concern. Her casual dismissal of their efforts as a minor annoyance spoke to the arrogance that characterized Piltover's ruling class, but it also suggested that forces far more powerful than they had initially realized were manipulating events from behind the scenes. When Camille finally chose to act against them, her decision was motivated not by moral outrage, but by the practical concern that their interference was disrupting her family's business operations. The battle with Camille demonstrated the vast gulf that existed between Ekko's improvisational technology and the sophisticated augmentations that money could buy in Piltover's exclusive markets. Her body had been completely rebuilt using the finest hex tech available, transforming her into a living weapon whose capabilities far exceeded anything that could be achieved through natural human ability. Yet, despite her technological advantages, she was ultimately defeated by the combination of Ekko's creativity and his willingness to take risks that her programmed responses could not anticipate. Future Ekko's decision to form a temporary alliance with Camille represented another example of the moral compromises that had shaped his character over the years. His younger self's objections to working with someone who represented everything wrong with the current system were dismissed as naive idealism that had no place in the practical work of saving two cities from destruction. The alliance would last only as long as their interests aligned, but it demonstrated how desperate circumstances could force unlikely partnerships between former enemies. The infiltration of the Piltradestra stronghold revealed the full extent of the criminal family's ambitions and their willingness to risk countless lives in pursuit of power and profit. The facility they had constructed for Hexite production was a monument to greed and recklessness, featuring inadequate safety measures and working conditions that virtually guaranteed eventual catastrophe. The workers employed in these operations were treated as expendable resources, their lives valued less than the materials they processed. The confrontation with the Piltradestra siblings proved that criminal organizations could be just as dangerous as corporate entities when armed with advanced technology and unlimited ambition. Their augmentations and weaponry rivaled anything produced by legitimate manufacturers. demonstrating how the black market had evolved to serve clients whose needs could not be met through legal channels. The battle against these enhanced criminals tested Ekko's skills to their limits and forced him to rely increasingly on temporal manipulation to survive encounters that would have been impossible to win through conventional means. Future Ekko's final plan to destroy all hexite crystals by detonating them in a controlled explosion that would affect both cities equally represented the ultimate expression of his willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good. His proposal to accept civilian casualties in order to prevent an even greater catastrophe forced his younger self to confront the terrible mathematics of utilitarian ethics, where individual lives became variables in equations designed to minimize overall suffering. The philosophical debate between past and future selves reached its climax as they stood on the precipice of implementing a plan that could save thousands of lives at the cost of hundreds of others. Future Ekko's argument that some prices were worth paying to prevent greater tragedies was met by his younger counterparts' insistence that they had a responsibility to find solutions that did not require innocent people to die. For the sake of mathematical abstractions, the resolution of their conflict came not through philosophical debate, but through practical action, as the younger Ekko chose to prevent his future self from implementing a plan that violated every principle he held dear. The battle between different versions of the same person served as a metaphor for the internal struggles that every individual faces when choosing between competing moral imperatives, highlighting how circumstances can transform idealistic intentions into pragmatic compromises. The creation of a new timeline where the Hexite crisis was resolved without mass casualties represented a victory for the principles that defined the younger Ekko's character, but it came at the cost of erasing the experiences and relationships that had shaped his future self's journey. The sacrifice made by future Ekko in accepting the dissolution of his timeline demonstrated that even the most hardened individuals could retain enough of their original humanity to choose hope over despair when given the opportunity to start over. As the crisis reached its resolution and the immediate threat of Hexite-induced catastrophe was eliminated, Ekko found himself forever changed by the experience of confronting his own potential future. The knowledge that he possessed the capacity for both great heroism and terrible moral compromise would influence every decision he made in the years to come, serving as both warning and inspiration as he continued to develop his abilities and to find his place in the world, in the reality we call Arcane, where the Undercity of Zaun existed in an even more precarious relationship with the gleaming towers of Piltover above. Ekko's story began not in the home of loving parents, but in the shadow of tragedy and loss. The Revolutionary War that had once promised freedom for Zaun's oppressed citizens had instead become a catastrophe that claimed countless innocent lives, leaving behind a generation of orphaned children who would grow up knowing only the bitter taste of defeat and the constant presence of grief. Among those who lost everything in the failed uprising were Ekko's parents, whose names and faces had been lost to the chaos of urban warfare, but whose absence shaped every aspect of his early development. The young boy who might have grown up surrounded by family love and parental guidance instead found himself dependent on the kindness of community members who had their own struggles to face. Benzo, a gruff but caring pawn shop owner who had been friends with Ekko's parents before their deaths, took in the brilliant child and provided him with the stability and mentorship that would prove crucial in shaping his character. The pawn shop that became Ekko's second home was a fascinating crossroads of cultures and technologies, where items from both Zon and Piltover found their way through networks of trade, salvage, and occasional theft. Benzo's establishment served as neutral ground where people from all walks of life could conduct business without the political tensions that normally divided the two cities, creating an environment where a curious young mind could observe the full spectrum of human nature and technological innovation. Working as Benzo's assistant taught Ekko valuable lessons about the nature of value and the stories that objects could tell about their owners and origins. Every piece of equipment that passed through the shop carried with it fragments of history, whether it was a broken chronometer from a Piltovan workshop or a jury-rigged chemical processor that had kept a Zon family fed for generations. Through careful observation and patient questioning, Ekko learned to read these technological artifacts like books, understanding not just how they functioned, but why they had been created and what needs they had been designed to fulfill. The most significant relationships of Ekko's childhood were formed through his connection to Vander, the former revolutionary leader who had transformed himself into a protector and father figure for Zaun's most vulnerable residents. Vander's adoptive children, Vi and Powder, along with their brothers Milo and Clagger, became Ekko's closest friends and companions, creating a surrogate family structure that provided the emotional support and sense of belonging that every child requires to develop properly. Vi's natural leadership abilities and her dedication to protecting those she cared about made her a role model for the younger children who looked up to her with admiration and respect. Her fighting skills, honed through years of navigating Zon's dangerous streets, represented everything that Ekko wished he could become in terms of physical capability and confident self-assurance. The sparring sessions and training exercises that Vi conducted taught him not just the mechanics of combat, but the importance of discipline, preparation, and strategic thinking in any confrontation. Powder's relationship with Ekko was more complex and intimate, built on their shared love of mechanical devices and their mutual status as the younger members of their impromptu family. While Vi excelled at direct action and physical solutions to problems, Powder and Ekko bonded over their fascination with gadgets, explosives, and the intricate clockwork mechanisms that powered much of Zon's industrial infrastructure. Their collaborative experiments and friendly competitions pushed both young inventors to develop their skills more rapidly than they might have achieved working alone. The nickname Little Man that the group bestowed upon Ekko reflected both his diminutive stature and their affectionate acceptance of him as part of their inner circle. Though he was not one of Vander's official adoptive children, he was treated with the same care and protection that the former revolutionary extended to his own family, creating bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation that would endure through the darkest periods of their shared history. The incident that would ultimately shatter this peaceful existence began with Ekko's sharp observations and natural suspicion of outsiders who did not belong in Zaun's familiar social ecosystem. When Jace, a young student from Piltover's prestigious academy, entered Benzo's pawn shop seeking specific components for his research, something about his manner and demeanor immediately triggered Ekko's protective instincts. The young Piltovan's obvious wealth and educated speech patterns marked him as someone whose presence in the Undercity required explanation and scrutiny. Ekko's decision to overcharge the obviously wealthy customer was motivated by more than simple greed or opportunism. In the economic relationship between Zaun and Piltover, Undercity residents were consistently exploited and undervalued, their labor and resources extracted to fuel the prosperity of the city above, while they received minimal compensation for their contributions. By demanding premium prices from someone who could clearly afford to pay them, Ekko was engaging in a small act of economic justice that helped to balance the scales in a system that was inherently unfair. The curiosity that compelled Ekko to follow Jace back to Piltover reflected his natural desire to understand the larger world beyond Zaun's borders and to investigate anything that might affect his community's welfare. The knowledge he gained about Jace's Hextech experiments would prove to be the catalyst for a chain of events that would ultimately transform both cities, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than interesting intelligence about the activities of Piltover's academic elite. When Vi learned about Jace's research and the valuable materials he possessed, her decision to organize a heist represented the kind of bold leadership that had made her a respected figure among Zaun's younger generation. The plan to steal Hextech crystals from a Piltovan apartment was ambitious and dangerous, but it also offered the possibility of obtaining resources that could be used to improve conditions for their community. The potential benefits seemed to outweigh the risks, especially for young people who had grown up believing that direct action was sometimes necessary to achieve justice. The inclusion of Powder in the heist team, despite her reputation for causing unintended complications, reflected the complex dynamics of family loyalty that governed their relationships. Though Milo and Clagor expressed serious reservations about bringing someone so prone to accidents on such a delicate mission, Vi's determination to include her sister overrode their practical concerns. The decision would prove to have catastrophic consequences, but it was motivated by love and the desire to give Powder an opportunity to prove herself capable of contributing to their shared endeavors. The heist itself unfolded with the kind of unpredictable chaos that characterized many of their previous adventures. Though the stakes were higher than anything they had previously attempted, while the team successfully penetrated Jace's apartment and located the Hextech crystals he had been studying, the mission quickly deteriorated when enforcers responded to reports of the break-in. The pursuit that followed forced them to flee through Piltover's unfamiliar streets while carrying stolen property that would have severe legal consequences if they were captured. Powder's decision to dispose of most of the stolen crystals by throwing them into the harbor was a practical response to the immediate threat of capture, but it also represented a tragic waste of resources that could have transformed their community's fortunes. The few crystals she managed to retain would prove to be far more significant than anyone realized at the time, containing energies and possibilities that exceeded their wildest imagination. The explosion that resulted from Powder's accidental activation of the Hextech crystals sent shockwaves through both cities that extended far beyond the immediate physical damage. For Piltover's ruling council, the incident represented a security breach that threatened the carefully maintained balance of power between the two cities, requiring immediate action to prevent further escalation. For Zaun's residents, it marked the beginning of a period of increased scrutiny and enforcement that would make their already difficult lives even more challenging. Vander's meeting with Sheriff Grayson to discuss the situation revealed the delicate diplomatic arrangements that had maintained relative peace between the cities for years. Their mutual respect and shared commitment to preventing unnecessary violence had created a framework for managing conflicts before they could escalate into open warfare. But the Hextech incident threatened to overwhelm these established mechanisms for maintaining stability. The peace treaty that Vander had negotiated with Piltover's enforcement authorities represented years of careful diplomacy and painful compromise, sacrificing some of Zaun's autonomy in exchange for protection from the kind of military intervention that had devastated the Undercity during previous conflicts. When Ekko discovered the details of these arrangements through his own investigation, he gained a new understanding of the impossible choices that leaders sometimes faced when trying to protect their communities from forces beyond their control. Vi's decision to surrender herself to face justice for the heist demonstrated the same sense of responsibility and protective instinct that had made her a natural leader among her peers. Though the sacrifice would have been personally devastating, she understood that someone needed to accept accountability for their actions to prevent Piltover's authorities from taking more drastic measures against the entire community. Her willingness to bear the consequences alone reflected the kind of selfless courage that had always defined her character. However, the political situation was being manipulated by forces that none of them fully understood at the time. Silco, the ambitious Chem Baron who had spent years building a criminal empire in Zaun's shadows, saw the crisis as an opportunity to advance his own agenda for Undercity independence. His vision of Zaun as a sovereign nation free from Piltovan control required the elimination of moderate voices like Vander, who advocated for peaceful coexistence rather than revolutionary conflict. The shimmer that Silco had been developing in partnership with the brilliant but twisted chemist, Singed, represented a new form of power that could potentially shift the balance between the cities. This chemical enhancement drug could transform ordinary humans into superhuman fighters capable of challenging even Piltover's most advanced enforcement technologies, offering Zaun a weapon that could level the playing field in any future conflict. Silco's alliance with the corrupt enforcer, Marcus, demonstrated how institutional betrayal could undermine even the most carefully constructed diplomatic arrangements. Marcus's willingness to provide intelligence and support to criminal organizations in exchange for personal gain represented the kind of systemic corruption that made meaningful reform impossible through conventional political channels. The kidnapping of Vander by Silco's enhanced agents marked the beginning of open hostilities that would ultimately consume both cities in violence and chaos. The death of Binzo during this operation was particularly devastating for Ekko, as it removed one of the most important stabilizing influences in his young life and forced him to confront the reality that the peaceful world he had known was being systematically destroyed by forces beyond his control. Witnessing the brutal murder of his mentor and guardian while hiding helplessly nearby was a traumatic experience that would shape Ekko's understanding of justice and responsibility for years to come. The sight of Silco's shimmer-enhanced enforcer casually killing a defenseless shop owner crystallized his hatred for the Chem Baron's methods and his determination to find ways to protect innocent people from similar fates. The rescue mission that Vi organized to save Vander demonstrated both the courage and the limitations of their small group when confronted with organized criminal power. Though they succeeded in reaching their captured father figure, the mission ultimately failed due to Powder's well-intentioned but catastrophically misguided attempt to help by using one of the remaining Hextech crystals to create an explosive device. The explosion that resulted from Powder's improvised bomb not only failed to rescue Vander, but actually caused the deaths of Milo and Clagger, while allowing Silco to escape with minimal injuries. The tragic irony of the situation, where an attempt to save their family resulted in destroying it, highlighted the dangerous unpredictability of Hextech technology and the devastating consequences that could result from good intentions combined with insufficient knowledge. Vi's emotional breakdown in the aftermath of the disaster was a natural response to the loss of her brothers and the realization that her sister's actions had directly contributed to their deaths. Her decision to call Powder a jinx and abandon her reflected the kind of cruel honesty that emerges from overwhelming grief, though it would prove to have lasting psychological consequences for both sisters. Silco's decision to take in the abandoned and traumatized Powder was motivated by a combination of opportunism and genuine sympathy for a child who had been rejected by her own family. His recognition that they were both outcasts who had been betrayed by people they trusted created the foundation for a twisted surrogate father-daughter relationship that would ultimately transform the innocent young inventor into one of Zaun's most dangerous criminals. The years that followed these traumatic events saw fundamental changes in the political and social structure of both cities that would reshape Ekko's world in ways he could never have anticipated. Piltover's development of Hextech technology under Jace and Victor's leadership transformed the city into a center of innovation and prosperity, while Zaun descended deeper into criminality and violence. Under Silco's increasingly authoritarian rule, the disappearance of Vi following her arrest left a leadership vacuum among Zaun's younger generation that no one was prepared to fill adequately. Though many of her former associates attempted to continue her work of protecting vulnerable community members, none possessed her natural charisma or her ability to inspire others to follow her into dangerous situations. Ekko's response to these changed circumstances was to forge a new path that combined his technical abilities with his growing understanding of the political forces that shaped his world. Rather than attempting to replace Vi as a traditional gang leader, he created something entirely different, a resistance organization that used advanced technology and guerrilla tactics to fight against the criminal elements that were destroying his community from within. The formation of the Firelights represented Ekko's evolution from a curious young inventor into a serious, revolutionary leader, committed to protecting Zaun's innocent residents from the predations of both criminal organizations and Piltovan authorities. The group's name reflected their connection to the bioluminescent creatures that provided natural light in Zaun's darkest corners, symbolizing their role as sources of hope and guidance in an increasingly dangerous world. The development of hoverboard technology that allowed Firelight's members to move rapidly through Zaun's three-dimensional urban landscape was a breakthrough that demonstrated Ekko's growing mastery of advanced engineering principles. These devices not only provided tactical advantages in combat situations, but also served as symbols of technological innovation that originated in the Undercity rather than being imported from Piltover's workshops. The masks worn by Firelight's members served multiple practical and symbolic purposes, protecting their identities from retaliation, while also creating a visual representation of their commitment to defending their community against all threats. The anonymity provided by these disguises allowed ordinary citizens to join their operations without fear of personal consequences, expanding their base of support throughout Zaun's various districts. The philosophy that guided the Firelight's operations was fundamentally different from both Silco's revolutionary nationalism and Vander's accommodating diplomacy. Rather than seeking to overthrow existing power structures or negotiate better terms within them, Ekko focused on creating alternative systems that could protect and nurture the community, regardless of who held official authority in either city. The years that passed between Powder's transformation into Jinx and Vi's eventual return to Zaun were marked by an escalating cycle of violence and desperation that fundamentally altered the character of the Undercity. What had once been a community struggling against poverty and oppression became something far darker, a place where survival required constant vigilance and where innocence was a luxury that few could afford to maintain. Silco's grip on power tightened with each passing season, his shimmer empire expanding through networks of dealers and enforcers who spread the toxic substance throughout every district and social stratum. The girl who had once been known as Powder ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, replaced by a volatile and unpredictable force of destruction who answered only to the name Jinx. Under Silco's twisted guidance, she had developed into one of the most feared criminals in Zaun's history. Her natural genius for mechanical innovation perverted into an obsession with explosive devices and weapons of increasing lethality. The innocent child who had once built trinkets and gadgets for the amusement of her friends now crafted instruments of terror that could level city blocks with casual efficiency. Ekko's surveillance network throughout Zaun provided him with regular updates on Jinx's activities, each report more disturbing than the last. Her attacks on Piltovan targets had grown increasingly bold and destructive, demonstrating a complete disregard for civilian casualties that would have been unthinkable for the girl he had once known. The bombs she planted in marketplaces and government buildings were designed not just to destroy property, but to maximize human suffering, turning everyday spaces into scenes of carnage that traumatized entire communities. The Firelight's operations against Silco's shimmer distribution networks had become increasingly dangerous, as the Chembarons organization grew more sophisticated and better armed. What had begun as simple raids on drug shipments had evolved into complex military-style operations that required careful planning and precise execution to avoid catastrophic casualties. Each successful mission seemed to prompt Silco to escalate his security measures, leading to an arms race between the resistance organization and the criminal empire that controlled ever larger portions of the Undercity. The hoverboard technology that Ekko had developed for the Firelights represented a significant tactical advantage in their guerrilla warfare campaign, allowing them to strike quickly at enemy positions before disappearing into Zahn's maze of pipes, walkways, and abandoned buildings. The devices required constant maintenance and improvement as Silco's forces adapted their defensive strategies to counter the Firelight's mobility advantages, creating an ongoing cycle of innovation and counter-innovation that pushed both sides to develop increasingly sophisticated technologies. The masks that concealed the identities of Firelight's members had become symbols of hope for ordinary citizens who had grown tired of living in fear of criminal retribution. Children throughout Zahn drew pictures of the distinctive owl-like designs on walls and surfaces, creating impromptu shrines that demonstrated the organization's growing cultural significance. However, these displays of support also made their wearers targets for Silco's enforcers, who offered substantial bounties for information leading to the capture of any Firelight's operative. When news reached Ekko that Vi had somehow returned to Zahn after years of imprisonment in Piltover's detention facilities, his initial reaction was a mixture of joy and apprehension that reflected the complex emotions surrounding his childhood friend's disappearance. The girl who had been like an older sister to him represented a connection to happier times when their greatest concerns had been avoiding Vander's lectures and finding new places to explore in the Undercity's endless maze of tunnels and chambers. However, Vi's return was complicated by her association with Caitlin Karaman, a Piltovan enforcer whose presence in Zahn immediately raised questions about her true motives and agenda. The sight of his former friend working alongside someone who wore the uniform of their oppressors was deeply troubling to Ekko, who had spent years fighting against the very institutions that Caitlin represented. The possibility that Vi had been corrupted or coerced during her imprisonment added another layer of concern to an already complex situation. The decision to have Vi and Caitlin followed by Firelight's surveillance teams reflected Ekko's natural caution and his hard-won understanding that appearances could be deceiving in Zaun's dangerous political landscape. Too many good people had been destroyed by trusting the wrong individuals or failing to verify the true intentions of those who claim to be allies. The intelligence gathering operation was designed to determine whether Vi's return represented an opportunity for cooperation or a threat that needed to be neutralized before it could cause harm to the Firelight's operations. The reports from his surveillance teams painted a picture of two individuals who seemed genuinely committed to tracking down Jinx and holding her accountable for her crimes, though their methods and ultimate objectives remained unclear. Vi's obvious emotional investment in finding her sister suggested that personal rather than political motivations were driving her action, while Caitlyn's professional demeanor indicated that she was operating under official Piltovan authority with resources and backing that could prove either helpful or dangerous. The revelation that Jinx had successfully stolen advanced hex-tech technology directly from Jace's laboratory represented a significant escalation in both her capabilities and the threat she posed to both cities. The gemstone and research materials she had acquired could potentially be used to create weapons of unprecedented destructive power, making her capture or elimination a matter of urgent importance for anyone concerned with public safety. However, the theft had also prompted Piltovan authorities to increase their enforcement activities in Zaun, creating additional pressures for organizations like the Firelights, who operated in the shadows. When Marcus, the corrupt enforcer who had been secretly working with Silco for years, used the theft as justification for launching a manhunt targeting the Firelights, Ekko realized that the political situation was deteriorating more rapidly than he had anticipated. The false accusations against his organization were clearly designed to distract attention from the real perpetrators, while eliminating a source of resistance to Silco's criminal empire. The strategy was both clever and ruthless, demonstrating the kind of institutional corruption that made meaningful reform impossible through conventional channels. The decision to intervene when Vi and Caitlyn encountered Jinx during their investigation represented a calculated risk that could have gone disastrously wrong if not for careful planning and precise execution. The Firelight's ability to capture both the Piltovan enforcer and the legendary Vi while simultaneously securing the stolen Hextech gemstone demonstrated their growing sophistication as an organization, though it also revealed their existence to individuals who might pose threats to their future operations. The interrogation of Vi at the Firelight's base provided Ekko with his first opportunity in years to speak directly with someone who had been present during the traumatic events that had shaped all their lives. Her account of recent developments confirmed many of his suspicions about Jinx's transformation, while also revealing details about Silco's organization that could prove valuable in future operations. However, the reunion was complicated by the presence of Caitlyn, whose status as an outsider made honest communication difficult and potentially dangerous. The revelation that Vi and Caitlyn were pursuing the same objectives as the Firelights created an opportunity for cooperation, though significant obstacles remained to be overcome before any formal alliance could be established. Vi's emotional connection to Jinx made her a potentially unreliable partner in any operation that might require decisive action against the unstable criminal, while Caitlyn's loyalty to Piltovan institutions could create conflicts of interest if the investigation uncovered evidence of high-level corruption or misconduct. Ekko's decision to work with Vi and Caitlyn, despite these reservations, reflected his pragmatic understanding that the threat posed by Jinx's possession of Hextech technology outweighed the risks associated with trusting former allies and uncertain partners. The stolen gemstone represented power that could potentially destroy both cities if it fell into the wrong hands or was used inappropriately, making its recovery a priority. that transcended personal grudges and political differences. The plan to transport the recovered gemstone to Piltover for analysis and safekeeping seemed like the most reasonable course of action given the limited options available to them. Neither Zaun nor the Firelights possessed the scientific expertise necessary to understand the technology they had recovered, while Piltovan researchers like Jace and Victor had demonstrated their ability to work with Hextech materials safely and effectively. However, the journey through Zaun's dangerous streets would expose them to attacks from multiple hostile factions who had their own reasons for wanting to acquire the valuable technology. The ambush, orchestrated by Marcus and his corrupt enforcers, demonstrated how thoroughly Silco's influence had penetrated Piltovan institutions, creating a web of betrayal and conspiracy that extended far beyond Zaun's criminal underworld. The sight of supposedly legitimate law enforcement officers working directly with criminal organizations confirmed Ekko's worst suspicions about the systemic corruption that made meaningful reform impossible through conventional political channels. When Jinx arrived at the ambush site with her arsenal of explosives and modified weapons, the situation immediately escalated beyond anything that conventional tactics could address effectively. Her complete disregard for the safety of everyone present, including the corrupt enforcers who had been working with her adoptive father, demonstrated the extent to which her mental state had deteriorated during her years under Silco's influence. The innocent girl who had once cried over accidentally breaking toys had become someone who treated human lives as disposable obstacles to her immediate objectives. Ekko's decision to remain behind and face Jinx alone while Vi and Caitlin escaped with the gemstone was motivated by a combination of tactical necessity and personal responsibility that reflected his growth as both a leader and an individual. The Firelights needed time to reach safety, and only he possessed the skills and equipment necessary to delay or defeat an opponent as dangerous and unpredictable as Jinx had become. However, the confrontation also represented a personal reckoning with the loss of someone who had once been among his closest friends. The battle that unfolded on the bridge, spanning one of Zaun's industrial chasms, was unlike any conflict that Ekko had previously experienced, combining advanced technology with deeply personal emotions in ways that made victory uncertain regardless of tactical advantages or superior preparation. Jinx's weapons were more sophisticated than anything she had previously deployed, incorporating Hextech enhancements that gave her explosives unprecedented destructive potential, while her own augmented reflexes and enhanced agility made her a formidable opponent in close combat. The strategy that Ekko employed during their confrontation drew upon memories of the games they had played as children, when Powder's predictable patterns had made her easy to defeat in contests of reflexes and timing. His ability to anticipate her movements based on childhood observations provided crucial advantages in a battle where split-second timing could mean the difference between life and death. However, the psychological weight of fighting someone who had once been like a sister to him created emotional burdens that threatened to undermine his tactical effectiveness. Each exchange of attacks and counterattacks revealed new layers of tragedy in Jinx's transformation from innocent inventor to dangerous criminal. The weapons she wielded were perversions of the creative genius that had once produced toys and gadgets for the amusement of her friends, while her tactical approach demonstrated a brilliant mind that had been twisted by trauma and manipulation into focusing solely on destruction and chaos. The girl, who had wanted nothing more than to help her family, had become someone who caused suffering wherever she went. The moment when Ekko gained a decisive advantage in their battle represented not just a tactical victory, but a profound confrontation with the past and the choices that had led them both to this point. As Jinx lay defeated and vulnerable beneath him, her mask torn away to reveal the face he remembered from their shared childhood, he was forced to confront the reality that some transformations were too complete to be reversed through violence or good intentions. The pause that cost him ultimate victory was both a moment of weakness and a demonstration of the humanity that separated him from the criminals and corrupt officials he fought against. Unlike Silco's enforcers or Marcus's corrupt law enforcement officers, Ekko retained enough of his original compassion to hesitate when faced with the opportunity to kill someone who had once been important to him. However, this moment of mercy provided Jinx with the opening she needed to activate her final explosive device. The detonation that followed destroyed the bridge and sent both combatants plummeting toward the toxic waters far below. Though Ekko's survival was ensured by emergency systems built into his hoverboard technology, the injuries he sustained during the fall were severe enough to incapacitate him for several days, during which time Jinx managed to recover the stolen gemstone and escape to continue her destructive rampage. The failure to capture or eliminate her represented a significant setback for both the Firelights and the broader effort to maintain stability in the region. Heimerdinger's discovery of Ekko's unconscious form in the aftermath of the battle marked the beginning of an unlikely partnership that would reshape both their understanding of the forces threatening their world. The ancient Yordle's centuries of experience with magical and technological phenomena provided valuable context for the strange patterns and anomalies that had been appearing throughout both cities, while Ekko's intimate knowledge of Zaun's underground networks offered practical insights that academic study could never provide. The collaboration between the displaced Piltovan counselor and the young revolutionary leader demonstrated how crisis could create opportunities for cooperation between individuals who might otherwise never have encountered each other. Heimerdinger's fascination with Ekko's hoverboard technology and his genuine respect for the engineering principles that had made such innovation possible helped to bridge the cultural and class divisions that normally separated Zaun's inventors from Piltover's academic establishment. The investigation they conducted into the mysterious patterns appearing throughout both cities revealed connections between Jace and Victor's Hextech research and the environmental anomalies that threatened to destabilize the entire region. The wild runes that were manifesting in increasingly dangerous forms suggested that the widespread use of Hextech technology was having unintended consequences that could prove catastrophic if left unchecked. However, understanding these phenomena would require resources and expertise that neither Zaun nor the Firelights possessed independently. The philosophical discussions that emerged from their partnership explored fundamental questions about the relationship between technological progress and social responsibility that had relevance far beyond their immediate circumstances. Heimerdinger's conservative approach to magical research reflected hard-won wisdom about the dangers of unchecked experimentation, while Ekko's innovative methods demonstrated how necessity could drive breakthroughs that more cautious researchers might never achieve. The growing trust between the unlikely partners represented a small but significant step toward healing the divisions that had long separated Za and Piltover's intellectual communities. Their collaboration suggested that cooperation based on mutual respect and shared objectives could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices and political obstacles, though such partnerships required constant effort and goodwill from all participants to remain viable. As their investigation deepened and the true scope of the crisis became apparent, both Ekko and Heimerdinger realized that preventing catastrophe would require interventions that neither of their communities could implement alone. The patterns they were observing suggested that the fundamental assumptions underlying Hextech development had been flawed from the beginning, creating systemic vulnerabilities that threatened not just both cities, but potentially the entire world. The knowledge that their individual struggles were part of a larger crisis, affecting forces beyond their understanding, provided new context for the conflicts that had defined their lives. The battle between Zahn and Piltover, the war against Silco's criminal empire, and even the personal tragedy of Jinx's transformation were all symptoms of deeper problems that required solutions on a scale that transcended local politics and personal grievances. The discovery of strange patterns appearing on the leaves of the great tree that served as the heart of the Firelight Sanctuary marked the beginning of an investigation that would ultimately reveal truths far more disturbing than anything Ekko had previously imagined. The ancient tree, which had provided both shelter and symbolic hope for countless displaced residents of Zahn, had begun exhibiting geometric formations that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. These markings were unlike anything found in nature. Their mathematical precision and crystalline structure suggesting artificial origins that defied conventional botanical understanding. Heimerdinger's examination of the affected foliage revealed patterns that corresponded to theoretical frameworks he had encountered during centuries of magical research, though their appearance in organic matter represented an unprecedented phenomenon that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between arcane energies and living systems. The Yordle's extensive knowledge of magical theory provided crucial context for understanding what they were observing, while his obvious concern about the implications suggested that these manifestations represented threats far more serious than simple environmental anomalies. The decision to investigate these patterns more thoroughly required venturing into Piltover itself, a journey that presented significant risks for someone who had spent years operating as a wanted criminal in the Undercity. Ekko's reputation among Piltovan authorities as a terrorist and revolutionary made his presence above ground extremely dangerous, while Heimerdinger's recent expulsion from the city's governing council meant that his ability to provide protection or legitimacy was severely limited. However, the urgency of their investigation outweighed these practical concerns, particularly given the possibility that the patterns might be spreading to other locations throughout both cities. The infiltration of Piltover's academic district required careful planning and precise timing to avoid the enhanced security measures that had been implemented in response to recent attacks by Jinx and other Zon-based criminals. Ekko's hoverboard technology provided crucial advantages in navigating the city's vertical architecture, while his experience with stealth operations allowed him to move through areas where his presence would have triggered immediate alarm and response from law enforcement authorities. The reunion with Jace in his laboratory represented a complex convergence of past relationships and present necessities that highlighted how dramatically circumstances had changed since their initial encounter years earlier. The young man who had once been an arrogant student purchasing components from Benzo's pawn shop had evolved into one of Piltover's most influential political and scientific figures, his hex tech innovations having transformed both cities in ways that their original creators had never anticipated. However, his willingness to listen to Heimerdinger's concerns and examine evidence from Zon demonstrated a maturity and responsibility that suggested positive changes in his character. Jace's explanation of the wild runes phenomenon provided crucial scientific context for understanding the forces that were beginning to manifest throughout the region. According to his research, these patterns represented the natural fingerprints of arcane energy in its raw and uncontrolled state, manifestations that occurred when magical forces exceeded the containment systems designed to regulate their expression. The discovery that these formations were appearing simultaneously in his controlled laboratory experiments and in the organic environment of Zon suggested that their hex-tech research had triggered consequences that extended far beyond their intended applications. The revelation that similar patterns had been detected in the underground infrastructure that supported both cities added new layers of urgency to their investigation. The hex-tech matrix that powered Piltover's gates and transportation systems was directly connected to fail-safe mechanisms installed beneath the Undercity, creating a network of magical conduits that could potentially amplify and spread any disruptions in the arcane energy flow. If these systems became destabilized, the resulting cascade failures could affect everything from basic utilities to the structural integrity of buildings throughout both cities. Ekko's immediate concern for Zon's water and ventilation systems reflected his intimate understanding of how dependent the Undercity's population was on infrastructure that had been designed and maintained by Piltovan engineers. The ductwork that carried breathable air through the gray and the pipes that delivered clean water to residential districts were all connected to the same underground network that housed the Hextech fail-safes, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by the wild rune phenomenon to cause mass casualties among the most vulnerable populations. The descent into the underground maintenance tunnels revealed the true scope of the Hextech infrastructure that had been hidden beneath both cities for years. These passages contained machinery and conduit systems whose complexity rivaled anything visible in Piltover's public facilities, demonstrating the massive scale of the magical energy manipulation that had been necessary to create the gates and other advanced technologies. However, The presence of wild rune patterns throughout these systems indicated that the careful balance maintained by decades of engineering was beginning to break down in ways that could prove catastrophic. When the three investigators encountered a fully formed wild rune in the depths of the maintenance system, the decision to interact with it directly demonstrated either remarkable courage or dangerous foolishness. Jace's attempt to touch the arcane formation without proper protective equipment or understanding of its properties triggered a cascade of events that would fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself. The energy release that followed his contact with the rune sent shockwaves through both the magical and physical infrastructure of both cities, causing widespread malfunctions and anomalies that defied conventional understanding. The transportation effect that followed deposited each member of their group in different locations and timelines, separating them across dimensions of possibility that existed parallel to their own reality. This phenomenon represented the kind of advanced magical manipulation that even Heimerdinger's centuries of experience had not prepared him to understand or control, suggesting that they had encountered forces that operated according to principles beyond current scientific knowledge. Jace's displacement to a timeline where Hextech development had proceeded unchecked revealed the ultimate consequences of unregulated magical experimentation. In this devastated reality, the wild rune phenomenon had been allowed to spread without intervention, resulting in the complete collapse of civilization and the transformation of both cities into lifeless wastelands populated only by mechanical constructs animated by corrupted arcane energy. The android creatures that hunted him through this apocalyptic landscape represented the final evolution of Hextech technology when separated from human oversight and moral constraints. The injuries that Jace sustained during his desperate flight through this nightmare world served as physical reminders of the stakes involved in their investigation. His broken leg and other wounds demonstrated that the consequences of failure would extend far beyond academic or political disappointments, potentially resulting in the literal extinction of all life in their region. The isolation and despair he experienced during his time in this alternate timeline would fundamentally change his perspective on the responsibilities that came with scientific innovation. Meanwhile, Ekko and Heimerdinger's arrival in an alternate timeline presented them with a vision of what their world could have become under different circumstances. This reality represented a divergent path where the conflicts and tragedies that had defined their lives had been avoided through different choices and better outcomes, creating a society where Zaun and Piltover existed in genuine harmony rather than uneasy coexistence. The sight of this peaceful world was both inspiring and heartbreaking, demonstrating that the suffering they had endured was not inevitable, but rather the result of specific decisions and failures. In this alternate timeline, the academic institutions of Piltover had embraced students from Zaun as equals rather than treating them as curiosities or tokens, creating an integrated educational system that drew upon the strengths and perspectives of both communities. The sight of himself as a respected student rather than a hunted revolutionary forced Ekko to confront questions about the path his own life had taken and the choices that had led him to become a resistance fighter rather than a scholar or researcher. The relationship between alternate versions of Zahn and Piltover revealed possibilities for cooperation and mutual benefit that seemed almost utopian compared to the bitter conflicts that defined their own timeline. Here, the technological innovations developed by Piltovan researchers were shared freely with Undercity communities, while the practical ingenuity and resourcefulness of Zahn's inventors enriched the academic understanding of engineering principles. The absence of the class barriers and institutional prejudices that had shaped their own experiences demonstrated how different leadership and cultural attitudes could produce dramatically different outcomes. The presence of Vander and Silco working together as allies rather than enemies highlighted how personal relationships and political choices had contributed to the tragedies that had befallen their own timeline. These former friends had found ways to reconcile their different visions for Zahn's future, creating collaborative approaches to independence and self-determination that avoided the violence and corruption that had characterized Silco's revolutionary methods in their own reality. Most significantly, the survival of Milo and Clagger in this alternate timeline provided evidence that the explosion which had claimed their lives had not been an inevitable result of Hextech experimentation, but rather a consequence of specific circumstances that could have been avoided through better planning and preparation. Their continued existence as successful inventors and community leaders demonstrated the potential that had been lost when Powder's well-intentioned but poorly executed rescue attempt had gone catastrophically wrong. The relationship between Ekko and the alternate version of Powder represented perhaps the most poignant reminder of what had been lost when their own timeline had diverged toward tragedy and conflict. This Powder had retained all the creativity and enthusiasm that had defined her childhood personality, but had been able to develop these qualities in an environment of support and encouragement rather than trauma and abandonment. Her innovations and inventions served constructive rather than destructive purposes, demonstrating how different circumstances could have channeled her genius toward healing rather than harm. The romantic relationship that had developed between alternate Ekko and Powder highlighted possibilities that had been foreclosed by the traumatic events that had shaped their own lives. The trust and affection they shared represented the natural evolution of their childhood friendship, under circumstances where external pressures had not forced them into opposing roles. However, this relationship also created emotional complications for the displaced Ekko, who found himself developing feelings for someone who was simultaneously familiar and fundamentally different from the person he had known. Heimerdinger's extended stay in this alternate timeline provided him with opportunities to observe how different approaches to magical research and technological development could produce more positive outcomes. The collaboration between Yordle wisdom and human innovation had created advances that surpassed anything achieved in their own timeline, while maintaining the safety protocols and ethical considerations that had been abandoned in their reality's rush toward technological supremacy. The discovery that Heimerdinger had been present in this alternate timeline for over 3 years, while only hours had passed in their own reality, demonstrated the complex temporal mechanics that governed interdimensional travel. His initial despair and eventual acceptance of his displacement reflected the psychological challenges involved in adapting to circumstances that were simultaneously better and worse than one's original situation. Though this world was more peaceful and prosperous, it was not his home, and the people he cared about in his original timeline remained in danger. The scientific challenge of creating a device capable of returning them to their own timeline required combining theoretical knowledge that existed only in Heimerdinger's memory with practical materials that could be scavenged from this reality's less advanced technology base. The absence of Hextech development in this world meant that they had to work with primitive components and limited energy sources, forcing them to develop innovative solutions that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available resources. The collaboration between Ekko, Heimerdinger, and alternate powder in developing their interdimensional transport device represented the kind of cross-cultural scientific cooperation that should have been possible in their own timeline under different circumstances. The combination of Yordle magical theory, undercity practical engineering, and untainted creative genius produced innovations that none of them could have achieved working alone, demonstrating the potential benefits of genuine intellectual partnership. The prototype device they constructed operated on principles that inverted the standard functions of Hextech technology, using temporal manipulation rather than spatial transportation to achieve their objectives. The 4-second limitation they discovered during testing represented a compromise between the energy constraints imposed by their primitive materials and the minimum duration necessary to achieve meaningful effects. This limitation would prove crucial in determining how the technology could be deployed in their eventual return to their own timeline. The experimental phase of their project required numerous iterations and refinements as they learned to control forces that operated according to principles none of them fully understood. Heimerdinger's experience during one failed test, where he was briefly scattered across multiple dimensions before being reconstituted, demonstrated the extreme dangers involved in their work and the potential consequences of miscalculation. However, their desperation to return home and prevent the catastrophic future that Jace had witnessed drove them to continue despite these risks. The final version of their device required a crucial component that could only be provided by Ekko's technical expertise and understanding of temporal mechanics. His ability to invert the functions of the accelerator rune that powered their system represented the kind of innovative thinking that had made him a successful revolutionary leader, while also demonstrating how his skills could be applied to constructive rather than destructive purposes when given appropriate opportunities and resources. The decision to leave the alternate timeline was complicated by emotional attachments that had developed during their extended stay and the knowledge that they were abandoning a world that was in many ways superior to their own. The relationship between Ekko and alternate powder had deepened into genuine love, creating personal stakes that made departure emotionally devastating, even when it was logically necessary. However, their commitment to protecting the people they had left behind in their own timeline ultimately outweighed these personal considerations. The farewell between Ekko and alternate powder represented a profound meditation on the nature of choice, sacrifice, and responsibility that would influence his future decisions and moral development. Their final dance and the kiss they shared served as both celebration of what they had found together and acknowledgement of what they were choosing to abandon in service of larger obligations. The promise to remember each other across the boundaries of different realities provided some comfort, though it could not eliminate the pain of permanent separation. Heimerdinger's sacrifice to ensure their successful return demonstrated the kind of courage and selflessness that had motivated his centuries of service to both scientific advancement and public welfare. His willingness to remain behind or face dissolution rather than risk Ekko's safety reflected his understanding that some responsibilities transcended personal survival and that knowledge was meaningless unless it could be used to protect others. The uncertainty surrounding his fate after their departure would haunt Ekko throughout the conflicts that followed their return. The successful activation of their device and their return to their own timeline marked the end of one phase of their investigation and the beginning of far more dangerous challenges that would test everything they had learned during their interdimensional journey. The knowledge they had gained about alternate possibilities and the technology they had developed would prove crucial in the battles that lay ahead, though the emotional costs of their experience would continue to influence their decisions and relationships for years to come. The return to their original timeline brought with it an immediate and overwhelming sense of urgency as Ekko found himself thrust back into a world on the precipice of total collapse. The knowledge gained from witnessing alternate possibilities and the technology developed during his interdimensional journey provided him with unprecedented understanding of the forces threatening both cities, but this awareness came coupled with the devastating realization that time was running out to prevent catastrophe. The sacrifice that Heimerdinger had made to ensure their successful return weighed heavily on his conscience, serving as a constant reminder of the prices that others had paid to give him this opportunity to make a difference. The Zahn that greeted his return was fundamentally different from the one he had left behind, transformed by Victor's influence into something that bore only superficial resemblance to the community he had spent his life protecting. The brilliant inventor who had once worked alongside Jace to develop Hextech innovations had undergone his own transformation, emerging from his cocoon-like healing process as something that transcended ordinary human limitations, while simultaneously abandoning the moral constraints that had previously governed his actions. Victor's new form represented the ultimate expression of technological augmentation, taken to its logical extreme, his body having been so thoroughly integrated with arcane machinery that the boundaries between flesh and metal had become meaningless distinctions. The glowing energy that coursed through his modified physiology gave him capabilities that exceeded anything previously achieved through conventional Hextech enhancement, while his connection to the arcane allowed him to manipulate reality itself in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. The philosophy that now drove Victor's actions represented a radical departure from his previous commitment to using technology to improve human conditions without fundamentally altering human nature. His experiences with the Hex Core and his exposure to arcane energies had convinced him that organic consciousness was inherently flawed, prone to conflicts and contradictions that could only be resolved through the elimination of individual will and the creation of a unified collective mind that would be free from the emotional turbulence that had always plagued human civilization. The process by which Victor recruited followers to his cause was simultaneously seductive and terrifying, offering genuine healing and enhancement to individuals whose lives had been marked by suffering and deprivation. Those who came to him seeking relief from shimmer addiction, industrial injuries, or chronic illnesses found themselves not only cured, but elevated to levels of physical and mental capability they had never imagined possible. However, this transformation came at the cost of their individual autonomy, as the improvements to their bodies and minds were accompanied by neural modifications that linked them to Victor's collective consciousness. The spread of Victor's influence throughout Zaun's most vulnerable populations created a crisis that conventional resistance methods were completely inadequate to address. Unlike Silco's criminal organization, which had relied on fear and economic coercion to maintain control, Victor's movement attracted followers who genuinely believed that they were participating in humanity's next evolutionary step. The sense of purpose and belonging that his collective consciousness provided was particularly appealing to individuals who had spent their lives feeling isolated and powerless in the face of systemic oppression. Ekko's analysis of the situation revealed that traditional combat approaches would be not only ineffective, but potentially counterproductive when dealing with Victor's enhanced followers. These individuals retained their memories and personalities while gaining access to shared knowledge and coordinated responses that made them formidable opponents in any direct confrontation. Moreover, many of them were people he had known and cared about during his years as a community organizer, making the prospect of violent resistance emotionally devastating, even when it might be tactically justified. The alliance that had formed between Victor and Ambessa Medarda represented a convergence of technological innovation and military strategy that posed unprecedented threats to both cities. Ambessa's expertise in warfare and political manipulation provided Victor's movement with organizational capabilities and strategic direction that it had previously lacked, while her access to Noxian resources and personnel gave the collective consciousness the tools necessary to expand beyond Zaun's borders and threaten the stability of the entire region. The decision by Ambessa to support Victor's vision was motivated by her recognition that his technology could provide solutions to problems that had plagued military organizations for centuries. The elimination of fear, doubt, and conflicting loyalties from soldier populations would create armies of unprecedented effectiveness, while the shared consciousness that linked Victor's followers would enable coordination and response times that no conventional military force could match. However, her willingness to embrace such radical transformation suggested that she either did not understand or did not care about the implications for human autonomy and individual freedom. The preparation for the final confrontation required Ekko to synthesize everything he had learned about temporal mechanics, arcane theory, and human nature during his extraordinary journey across multiple realities. The Z-Drive technology that had been refined through his interdimensional experiences represented his most powerful tool for affecting the outcome of the approaching battle. but its effectiveness would depend on his ability to deploy it at precisely the right moment and in exactly the right way to achieve maximum impact. The reunion with Jinx presented perhaps the most emotionally complex challenge that Ekko had faced since beginning his mission to save both cities from destruction. The woman who had once been Powder had reached a point of such complete psychological breakdown that conventional communication seemed impossible, her grip on reality having been further loosened by exposure to shimmer, trauma, and the loss of Silco's stabilizing influence. Her preparation for self-destruction represented both a threat to innocent bystanders and a tragic waste of potential that could have been redirected toward constructive purposes under different circumstances. The strategy that Ekko employed to reach Jinx required him to endure repeated explosive attacks while using his temporal manipulation abilities to reset their conversation until he found approaches that could penetrate her psychological defenses. Each iteration of their interaction cost him physically, as the Z-Drive's limitations meant that he retained all injuries while gaining only the knowledge of what had failed in previous attempts. The dedication required to persist through dozens of painful failures demonstrated his commitment to saving someone who had become one of the most dangerous criminals in both cities. The breakthrough that finally allowed meaningful communication with Jinx came when Ekko abandoned attempts to convince her through logical argument and instead focused on emotional connection based on their shared history and mutual losses. His willingness to acknowledge the pain they had both experienced while refusing to accept that destruction was the only possible response created space for dialogue that had previously been impossible. The recognition that they were both products of the same traumatic circumstances that had shaped their community provided common ground for understanding despite their dramatically different responses to those experiences. The successful recruitment of Jinx to their cause represented a turning point that transformed the strategic balance of the approaching conflict in ways that neither side had anticipated. Her intimate knowledge of Silco's organization and her unparalleled expertise with explosive devices provided capabilities that the resistance movement had previously lacked, while her unpredictable nature and complete disregard for conventional tactics created advantages that could not be easily countered by Victor's methodical approach to problem solving. The preparation of their final assault required coordination between multiple groups that had historically been enemies or competitors, creating temporary alliances based on shared recognition that Victor's vision represented an existential threat to everything they valued about human civilization. The combination of Ekko's technological innovation, Jinx's destructive creativity, and the remaining Firelight's guerrilla warfare expertise created a force capable of challenging even Victor's enhanced collective consciousness. The battle that erupted across both cities represented the culmination of years of conflict and the collision of competing visions for humanity's future. Victor's followers fought with the coordination and determination of a unified organism, their shared consciousness allowing them to respond to threats and adapt to changing circumstances with unprecedented efficiency. However, their reliance on collective decision-making also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by opponents who understood how to disrupt their communication networks and coordination systems. The role of the Z-Drive in the final confrontation proved to be even more crucial than Ekko had anticipated, as Victor's mastery of arcane forces required countermeasures that operated according to principles beyond conventional physics. The temporal manipulation capabilities that Ekko had developed through his interdimensional experiences provided the only reliable method for disrupting Victor's reality-altering abilities and creating opportunities for more conventional forms of attack. The decision to push the Z-Drive beyond its established safety limitations represented a calculated risk that could have resulted in Ekko's complete destruction across multiple timelines simultaneously. The device had never been tested at the energy levels required to affect Victor's enhanced physiology, and the feedback effects from such extreme temporal manipulation could have scattered his consciousness across infinite parallel realities. However, the stakes involved in preventing Victor's vision from being realized made such risks acceptable compared to the consequences of failure. The transformation of the Z-Drive into a temporal weapon capable of disrupting Victor's connection to the arcane required modifications that drew upon everything Ekko had learned about the relationship between time, space, and consciousness during his journey through alternate realities. The integration of components salvaged from Piltovan technology with innovations developed in Zaun's workshops created a hybrid device that represented the best of both cities' technological traditions, while transcending the limitations that had previously constrained such collaborations. The moment when Ekko activated his modified Z-Drive and deployed it against Victor marked the convergence of multiple narrative threads that had been developing throughout their shared history. The young inventor, who had once struggled with the ethical implications of temporal manipulation, was now using those same abilities to preserve the autonomy and freedom that Victor's collective consciousness would have eliminated. The irony that salvation came through the very forces that Victor had sought to control and systematize demonstrated how human creativity and unpredictability could triumph over even the most sophisticated technological solutions. The explosion that resulted from the Z-Drive's temporal disruption of Victor's arcane matrix created effects that rippled across multiple dimensions of reality, temporarily destabilizing the barriers between different timelines and allowing glimpses of alternate possibilities to manifest in their own world. The energy release was so massive that it affected not only Victor's immediate followers, but the entire network of consciousness that had been spreading throughout both cities, severing the connections that had bound individual minds to the collective and restoring personal autonomy to thousands of people who had surrendered their independence. The aftermath of Victor's defeat left both cities in a state of profound transformation that would require years to fully understand and integrate. The individuals who had been part of his collective consciousness retained many of the enhancements and improvements that had been made to their bodies and minds, but were now free to make independent choices about how to use these capabilities. The sudden restoration of personal autonomy to people who had become accustomed to shared decision-making created psychological challenges that would require careful management and support. The recognition that Victor's vision had been motivated by genuine concern for human suffering and a sincere desire to eliminate the conflicts that had plagued civilization, provided important context for understanding how brilliant and well-intentioned individuals could pursue goals that ultimately threatened everything they claimed to protect. The tragedy of his transformation served as a reminder that technological solutions to human problems must always be balanced against considerations of personal freedom and individual dignity. The role that Ekko played in preventing catastrophe while preserving the possibility for positive change demonstrated how individual actions could affect the trajectory of entire civilizations when guided by wisdom, courage, and commitment to fundamental values. His willingness to sacrifice personal happiness and safety for the welfare of others had ultimately created opportunities for both cities to develop more equitable and sustainable relationships based on mutual respect rather than domination or exploitation. The price paid for victory included not only the personal losses and sacrifices made by individuals throughout both cities, but also the knowledge that the underlying tensions and structural problems that had made Victor's revolution possible remained largely unresolved. The defeat of one threat did not eliminate the conditions that had created it, meaning that continued vigilance and ongoing efforts toward genuine reform would be necessary to prevent similar crises from emerging in the future. The lessons learned from confronting Victor's collective consciousness would influence how both cities approached questions of technological development, social organization, and individual rights for generations to come. The understanding that even the most beneficial innovations could become tools of oppression if not properly regulated and democratically controlled provided important guidance for future policy decisions and research priorities. As the immediate crisis passed and both cities began the long process of rebuilding and reconciliation, Ekko found himself transformed by experiences that had pushed him far beyond the boundaries of ordinary human existence. The knowledge he had gained about the nature of time, reality, and consciousness would continue to influence his decisions and relationships for the rest of his life, while the responsibilities that came with such understanding would shape his role in the community he had fought so hard to protect. The concept of alternate realities had always fascinated scholars and philosophers throughout Runeterra. But for Ekko, these theoretical possibilities became lived experiences that shaped his understanding of identity, choice, and the fundamental nature of existence itself. Through the various timelines and dimensional variations that he encountered during his extraordinary journey, he discovered versions of himself that had developed under different circumstances, faced different challenges, and made different choices that led to dramatically different outcomes for both his personal development and his relationship with the world around him. In the Academy universe, where the conflicts and tragedies that had defined his original timeline were replaced by the relatively mundane challenges of institutional education, Ekko found himself contemplating what his life might have been like if his genius had been channeled toward academic achievement rather than revolutionary resistance. This alternate version of himself had grown up in a world where merit was rewarded through traditional educational pathways, where young inventors could pursue their passions without fear of persecution or exploitation, and where the gap between Zaun and Piltover had been bridged through inclusive institutions rather than violent conflict. The Academy Ekko's suspension for illegal use of chemistry equipment and electronics, combined with his penchant for vandalizing athletic facilities, suggested that even in more peaceful circumstances, his rebellious nature and willingness to challenge authority would have remained fundamental aspects of his character. The incidents that led to his disciplinary problems reflected the same innovative thinking and disregard for arbitrary restrictions that had made him an effective revolutionary leader, though in this context, his actions were directed toward pranks and academic experimentation rather than armed resistance against oppressive systems. The sight of traditional enemies like Darius functioning as students rather than warriors provided important insights into how environmental factors and social structures could shape individual development in unexpected ways. The transformation of a figure known primarily for his martial prowess and aggressive leadership into someone navigating the social dynamics of academic life demonstrated the plasticity of human nature and the extent to which circumstances could influence personality development and life choices. The project universe presented a far darker vision of technological advancement, where corporate power had evolved to the point where ordinary human autonomy had been systematically eliminated through comprehensive surveillance and control systems. In this cyberpunk dystopia, Ekko's role as a hacker and resistance fighter reflected the same commitment to protecting individual freedom that had characterized his actions in his original timeline, though the specific threats and challenges he faced were products of different historical developments and technological priorities. The augmentations that Project Ekko had received through corporate experimentation represented a perverse inversion of the voluntary enhancements that Victor had offered in their original timeline. Rather than promising liberation from human limitations, these modifications were designed to increase productivity and compliance, while eliminating the creative unpredictability that made individuals capable of independent thought and action. The fact that he had managed to retain enough autonomy to join the resistance movement suggested that even the most sophisticated control systems could not completely suppress the human spirit when it was properly motivated. The collaboration between Project Ekko and the resistance organization known as G-Netic demonstrated how opposition movements could emerge even in the most thoroughly controlled societies, when individuals retained enough moral clarity to recognize the difference between genuine improvement and sophisticated oppression. The group's commitment to preserving humanity in the face of corporate dehumanization reflected universal values that transcended the specific technological and political circumstances of any particular timeline. The Guardian of the Sands universe transported Ekko's essential characteristics into an entirely different cultural and technological context, where ancient magic and archaeological exploration replaced urban innovation and political resistance as the primary means of engaging with the world. This version of Ekko had dedicated his life to looting dangerous tombs and recovering artifacts from Shurima's buried past, channeling his natural curiosity and technical expertise toward understanding civilizations that had achieved greatness and then fallen into decay. The transformation of Ekko's role from urban revolutionary to desert explorer highlighted how his core personality traits of intellectual curiosity, technical innovation, and willingness to take calculated risks could be expressed through entirely different activities and life choices. The skills that had made him an effective resistance leader in Zaun translated naturally to the challenges of navigating ancient tomb defenses and recovering valuable artifacts from hostile environments. The historical and archaeological focus of Guardian of the Sands, Ekko's activities provided him with perspectives on the cyclical nature of civilization that were relevant to understanding the challenges facing his own timeline. The ruins he explored served as reminders that even the most advanced societies could collapse if they failed to maintain the balance between technological progress and social stability, offering lessons that could inform contemporary efforts to prevent similar disasters. The Star Guardian universe elevated Ekko's role from local community protector to cosmic defender, placing him within a team of young heroes chosen by fate to defend the universe itself against forces of darkness and chaos. This transformation represented the ultimate expression of his protective instincts and leadership abilities, while also demonstrating how individual actions could have consequences that extended far beyond any single planet or civilization. The responsibilities that came with Star Guardian status reflected the same moral weight that had driven Ekko's resistance activities in his original timeline, though the scale of the threats he faced and the powers available to him were correspondingly greater. The magical abilities granted to Star Guardians provided capabilities that exceeded anything possible through conventional technology, while the cosmic scope of their mission created stakes that dwarfed even the most significant local conflicts. The tragic nature of Star Guardian existence, where heroes were destined to burn brightly before falling catastrophically, provided a poignant parallel to the sacrifices that Ekko had witnessed and made throughout his own journey. The knowledge that their luminous service would inevitably end in darkness reflected the bittersweet reality that protection of others often required personal costs that could never be fully recovered or compensated. The True Damage universe represented perhaps the most optimistic reimagining of Ekko's potential, transforming him from a revolutionary fighter into an artist and cultural leader whose weapons were words and music, rather than explosives and temporal manipulation. In this reality, his genius for innovation had been channeled toward lyrical expression and technological artistry, creating works that could inspire and unite communities without requiring violence or destruction. True Damage Ekko's decision to remain in Zaun despite opportunities for personal advancement in the broader entertainment industry reflected the same community loyalty that had characterized his original timeline, though in this context, his service took the form of cultural leadership rather than armed resistance. His role as a voice for the young and hopeful demonstrated how artistic expression could serve similar functions to political activism in terms of providing inspiration and organizing opposition to injustice. The description of his prodigious lyricism and technological savvy suggested that even in a universe where conflict was resolved through cultural rather than military means, Ekko's fundamental nature as an innovator and communicator remained unchanged. The combination of artistic talent and technical expertise that defined his musical career represented the same synthesis of creativity and practical skill that had made him effective in other contexts. The Pulsefire universe presented the most technologically advanced version of Ekko's story, where time travel had become commonplace enough to require specialized law enforcement agencies dedicated to preventing temporal paradoxes and maintaining timeline stability. In this context, Ekko's role as a chronofugitive reflected his characteristic refusal to accept arbitrary authority, even when that authority was supported by advanced technology and institutional legitimacy. Pulsefire. Ekko's ability to create his own temporal manipulation equipment from scratch, and even improve upon the designs developed by official time. Police demonstrated that his innovative capabilities transcended any particular technological base or institutional support system. The fact that his homemade devices exceeded the performance of equipment produced by the most advanced enforcement organizations suggested that individual creativity and determination could overcome even the most sophisticated institutional advantages. The pursuit of Pulsefire Ekko by Remembrancer forces highlighted the eternal tension between individual freedom and collective security that had characterized his conflicts in other timelines. His status as a fugitive reflected not criminal intent, but rather his unwillingness to submit to systems of control that he viewed as illegitimate, regardless of their technological sophistication or official sanction. The toned skin commemorating the esports team's championship victory represented yet another context in which Ekko's competitive nature and strategic thinking could be expressed, this time through organized competition rather than survival conflict. The phoenix imagery associated with this skin reflected themes of renewal and rebirth that were consistent with his temporal manipulation abilities, while also suggesting the cyclical nature of victory and defeat in competitive environments. The Trick or Treat universe provided a lighter interpretation of Ekko's character that maintained his mischievous nature while placing it in a context of celebration rather than serious conflict. His use of temporal manipulation to maximize candy acquisition demonstrated how his extraordinary abilities could be deployed for purely personal gratification, though even in this frivolous context, his actions were driven by the same determination and creative problem-solving that characterized his more serious endeavors. The Halloween themes associated with this universe connected to broader cultural traditions surrounding death, transformation, and the supernatural that provided metaphorical frameworks for understanding Ekko's relationship with time and change. The playful subversion of these traditionally dark themes reflected his ability to find joy and humor, even in circumstances that might overwhelm individuals with less resilience and creativity. The Sandstorm universe's focus on archaeological exploration and treasure hunting provided another context for Ekko's natural curiosity and willingness to take risks in pursuit of knowledge or valuable resources. His role as a tomb raider reflected the same adventurous spirit that had led him to experiment with dangerous temporal technologies, though in this context, the primary threats came from ancient guardians and environmental hazards rather than political enemies. Each of these alternate realities served to illuminate different aspects of Ekko's fundamental character, while demonstrating how environmental factors and historical circumstances could shape the expression of basic personality traits in dramatically different ways. The consistency of certain characteristics across all timelines suggested that some aspects of individual identity transcended circumstantial influences, while the variations in his roles and relationships highlighted the importance of context in determining life outcomes. The multiplicity of possible Ekkos provided important insights into questions of personal identity and moral responsibility that had philosophical implications extending far beyond any particular timeline or reality. The recognition that infinite versions of himself existed across different dimensions raised complex questions about which choices and outcomes should be considered most authentic or meaningful when evaluating the significance of individual actions. The knowledge that alternate versions of himself had achieved different types of success and faced different types of challenges provided both inspiration and perspective that influenced how the original Ekko approached his own decisions and responsibilities. The understanding that other possibilities existed helped to contextualize both his achievements and his failures, while also reinforcing the importance of making choices that reflected his core values regardless of external circumstances. The technological innovations and artistic expressions that characterized different versions of Ekko's story demonstrated the remarkable range of human potential when properly nurtured and directed. The fact that the same fundamental personality could produce revolutionary leadership, artistic genius, cosmic heroism, or technological innovation, depending on circumstances, suggested that individual development was far more malleable and context-dependent than most people realized. The consistent themes of community protection, innovative thinking, and resistance to unjust authority that appeared across all timelines indicated that certain moral commitments and personality traits represented essential aspects of Ekko's identity that transcended any particular set of circumstances. These core characteristics provided stability and continuity, even as the specific challenges and opportunities he faced varied dramatically between different realities. The diversity of threats and opportunities that different versions of Ekko encountered served as a reminder that the universe contained possibilities for both tremendous achievement and catastrophic failure that exceeded anything that could be anticipated based on limited personal experience. The knowledge that other timelines had produced both utopian harmony and dystopian oppression provided important context for understanding the stakes involved in contemporary political and technological decisions. The ultimate lesson provided by exposure to multiple alternate realities was that individual choices mattered far more than most people realized, as small differences in decision-making could lead to dramatically different outcomes for entire civilizations. The responsibility that came with this understanding was both empowering and terrifying, as it suggested that every action had potential consequences that extended far beyond immediate circumstances and personal interests. The profound implications of Ekko's journey through time and across alternate realities extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of his personal story, touching upon fundamental questions about human nature, technological progress, and the responsibilities that accompany extraordinary power. His experiences offer insights into the complex relationship between individual choice and collective destiny, demonstrating how single decisions can ripple outward through time to affect the lives of countless others in ways that often exceed the comprehension of those making the original choices. The nature of time itself, as revealed through Ekko's temporal manipulations, proves to be far more fluid and malleable than most people realize, existing not as a fixed linear progression, but as a vast network of interconnected possibilities where past, present, and future influence each other in complex feedback loops. His ability to rewind specific moments and replay events with different outcomes demonstrates that the apparent inevitability of historical developments is often an illusion created by limited perspective rather than genuine causal necessity. The philosophical implications of temporal manipulation raise profound questions about free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of authentic experience that challenge conventional assumptions about ethics and personal identity. When someone possesses the ability to undo mistakes and retry difficult situations until achieving desired outcomes, the traditional relationship between choices and consequences becomes fundamentally altered in ways that can either enhance or undermine genuine moral development, depending on how such power is employed. Ekko's gradual understanding of these complexities reflects a maturation process that extends far beyond simple technical mastery of temporal mechanics, encompassing the development of wisdom and ethical judgment necessary to wield extraordinary power responsibly. His early tendency to use the Z drive for personal convenience and to manipulate social situations gradually evolved into a more restrained approach that prioritized the autonomy and dignity of others, even when more directive interventions might have produced better immediate outcomes. The burden of knowledge that comes with experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously creates psychological pressures that few individuals could endure without suffering significant emotional and mental strain. The constant awareness of alternative possibilities and different versions of familiar people generates a form of existential isolation that separates Ekko from others who exist within single timelines and can never fully comprehend the scope of his experiences or the weight of his responsibilities. The relationship between individual potential and environmental circumstances, as illustrated through Ekko's various alternate selves, reveals the remarkable plasticity of human development and the extent to which social structures and cultural contexts shape personal outcomes. The fact that the same fundamental personality could produce such dramatically different life paths depending on external factors demonstrates both the importance of creating supportive environments for human flourishing and the resilience of core character traits that persist across varying circumstances. The recurring themes of innovation, community protection, and resistance to unjust authority that appear throughout Ekko's story across multiple timelines suggest that certain moral commitments represent essential aspects of individual identity that transcend particular historical or technological contexts. These consistent elements provide stability and continuity even as the specific challenges and opportunities faced by different versions of himself vary dramatically based on environmental factors and societal conditions. The scientific breakthroughs that Ekko achieves through his temporal research have implications that extend far beyond their immediate applications, opening new frontiers of understanding about the fundamental nature of reality and the possibilities for human advancement. His innovations demonstrate how individual creativity and determination can push the boundaries of what seems possible, while also highlighting the importance of considering ethical implications and unintended consequences when developing powerful new technologies. The community organizing principles that guide Ekko's resistance activities reflect deep insights into the dynamics of social change and the conditions necessary for sustainable progress toward greater justice and equality. His understanding that lasting transformation requires not just the elimination of immediate threats, but the creation of alternative systems that can nurture human potential, demonstrates sophisticated awareness of the difference between reactive resistance and constructive revolution. The educational value of Ekko's experiences provides important lessons for anyone seeking to understand how individual actions can contribute to positive social change without falling into the traps of violence, authoritarianism, or moral compromise that have characterized so many historical movements for reform. His commitment to preserving human autonomy and dignity, even while working to eliminate systems of oppression, offers a model for ethical activism that avoids the excesses that often undermine revolutionary movements. The technological innovations that emerge from Ekko's research have potential applications in fields ranging from energy production and transportation to medicine and communication, though their development must be carefully managed to prevent the kind of uncontrolled proliferation that led to the Hextech crisis in his original timeline. The responsibility for ensuring that such powerful tools are used for constructive rather than destructive purposes requires ongoing vigilance and democratic oversight that extends far beyond any individual inventor or research institution. The psychological insights gained through Ekko's interactions with alternate versions of familiar people provide valuable understanding of how trauma, opportunity, and social support affect individual development and life outcomes. His observations of how the same personalities could evolve in dramatically different directions depending on circumstances offer important guidance for designing interventions and support systems that can help people overcome adverse conditions and achieve their full potential. The cultural impact of Ekko's story extends beyond its immediate entertainment value to include important symbolic and metaphorical dimensions that speak to universal human experiences of growth, loss, responsibility, and the search for meaning in complex and often hostile environments. His journey represents archetypal themes that resonate across different cultures and historical periods, providing frameworks for understanding personal and collective challenges that transcend any particular fictional setting. The relationship between individual genius and collective welfare that characterizes Ekko's story highlights the importance of ensuring that exceptional talents are channeled toward purposes that benefit entire communities rather than being exploited for narrow interests or personal aggrandizement. His commitment to using his abilities in service of others, even when doing so requires personal sacrifice and emotional hardship, demonstrates the kind of ethical leadership that societies need to navigate complex challenges successfully. The environmental implications of advanced technology development, as illustrated through the Hex-Tech crisis and its consequences for both Zaun and Piltover, provide important warnings about the need to consider long-term ecological and social effects when pursuing scientific and technological advancement. The disasters that result from prioritizing short-term benefits over sustainable development serve as cautionary tales about the importance of comprehensive impact assessment and precautionary principles in innovation policy. The intergenerational aspects of Ekko's legacy reflect the ongoing nature of social progress and the importance of each generation building upon the achievements and learning from the mistakes of their predecessors. His role in creating foundations for future development while also preserving valuable traditions and cultural knowledge demonstrates the delicate balance required to maintain continuity while enabling positive change and adaptation to new circumstances. The global implications of Ekko's innovations and the political changes they enable extend far beyond the immediate boundaries of Zaun and Piltover to encompass questions of international relations, technological proliferation, and the management of resources and capabilities that could fundamentally alter the balance of power among different nations and regions. The responsibility for preventing such technologies from being used for conquest or oppression requires international cooperation and oversight mechanisms that may not exist in current institutional frameworks. The artistic and creative dimensions of Ekko's character, as expressed through his murals, musical compositions, and aesthetic sensibilities, demonstrate the importance of maintaining space for beauty and expression, even in the midst of urgent practical challenges. His understanding that communities need not just material security, but also cultural richness and emotional fulfillment, reflects sophisticated awareness of the full spectrum of human needs and aspirations. The mentorship relationships that Ekko develops with younger inventors and activists represent crucial mechanisms for transmitting knowledge, values, and skills to future generations, while also ensuring that his insights and innovations continue to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. The responsibility for nurturing emerging talent while avoiding the creation of dependency or authoritarian relationships requires careful attention to the principles of empowerment and autonomous development. The healing and reconciliation processes that must follow major conflicts like those depicted in Ekko's story require sustained commitment to addressing underlying causes of division and inequality rather than simply managing symptoms or enforcing temporary truces. His understanding that genuine peace requires justice, and that justice requires ongoing effort to create fair and inclusive institutions, provides important guidance for post-conflict reconstruction and long-term stability. The spiritual and philosophical dimensions of Ekko's journey, particularly his encounters with forces that transcend ordinary physical reality, suggest that scientific and technological advancement must be balanced with attention to questions of meaning, purpose, and humanity's place in larger cosmic contexts. The integration of rational analysis with intuitive understanding and ethical commitment represents the kind of holistic approach to knowledge that may be necessary for addressing the most complex challenges facing contemporary civilization. And so we reach the end of our journey through time with Ekko, the boy who shattered time. From the smog-filled streets of Zaun to the vast expanse of multiple realities, his story reminds us that true genius lies not just in what we can create, but in what we choose to protect. Through every timeline, every possibility, every heartbreak and triumph, Ekko's core remains unchanged. A young man who refuses to accept that suffering is inevitable, who believes that every moment offers a chance to make things better. His Z-drive may control time, but his greatest power has always been hope. Hope that tomorrow can be different, that the past doesn't define the future, and that even the smallest spark of innovation can light the way forward. In the end, Ekko teaches us that perfection isn't the goal. The pursuit of something better is what makes us truly alive. Time may be a river, but sometimes, just sometimes, we can change its course.